let me take a quick moment and show you something called the grid here in Corel, which some people love. They go nuts for it. I personally don't use the grid very often. In fact, very, very rarely do I use the grid, but it's another tool that's available to us inside Corel, and I definitely should make you aware of it. It's simply a visual aid as you're laying out your documents, by the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head up to the View menu here and then down to Grid, and what that does is that overlays this grid, this series of horizontal and vertical lines over top of your entire document, over top of your entire workspace here inside Corel. And you can certainly use this, again, if you're laying out your documents, laying out your designs and all the rest of it. And again, some people love it, but again, I don't find myself using it all too often. Now, that said, let me show you a couple of neat things that you can do when you're working with your grid in terms of setting up your grid. I'm going to head back to the View menu up at the top here, and then all the way down to Setup, all the way down at the bottom. And then what I'll do is I'll choose Grid and Ruler Setup. Go ahead and do the same there. That'll bring you back into this Options dialog box where you can go and customize or set up your grids. So there's two main settings here. We have frequency, and there we have the horizontal, the number of grid lines horizontally per inch and the number of grid lines vertically per inch there. Or what you can do is you can use spacing. It's entirely up to you, whichever method you want to use. I usually use the defaults when I do very rarely use the grid. But again, you can come in here and you could make a tighter grid if you wanted to, or a looser grid. It's really up to you. We want to show the grid, so we'll make sure that that guy's turned on there. Now, what's snap to grid? Well, I don't know if you know about snapping or not, but essentially what it is again, it's another aid that we can use when we're drawing objects and working with shapes and so on inside our layouts. And essentially what it'll do is it will jump objects to the different grid points or grid divisions inside our layout. I'll show you this. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my snap to grid. And then we have show the grid as lines, or we can go show the grid as dots. I'm just going to switch mine to dots just to show you here. I'll go ahead and click on OK. So there's my grid of dots, if you will. And don't forget, I still have that snapping turned on, right? So what I'll do here, just a sort of a simple demonstration, is I'll go and grab my rectangle tool out of the toolbox. And you might notice this as I'm sort of moving my cursor around on the screen there. You see how my cursor is kind of jumping to these different dots? That's the snapping, right? So I can't bring my cursor between any of the dots. It's not going to let me start drawing my shape between any of these dots. So now if I click and drag, see how it's jumping there to the different dots? I can't, again, drop my rectangle between any of those dots. That's what snapping is. And again, the idea is that it's supposed to sort of help you out as you're designing your layouts and your designs and all the rest of it. Now, once again, snapping is something that I use sometimes. Other times I don't use it. Maybe later on I'll bring up snapping again in a different capacity. But anyway, there's your grid. There's how you can set up your grid and work with your grid. And don't forget, you can always head to the View menu and then down to Setup. And then, of course, over to Grid and Ruler Setup, and then, of course, go and adjust and manipulate your grid setup. So maybe I'll turn off my snap, and I'll go back to the grid lines here, and I'll click on OK. All right, there you go.
To change your